Hey, it's Alabama Annie, and welcome to part 19 of the Starlight Tavern, one of my books available on Kindle. Miss Hattie said, "Mary, Leonard Payne just called. He really needs us across the street. Eloise has taken ill, and he's called the doctor," she said. Mary stood up and pulled her robe around her. She walked to her closet and pulled out a pair of slacks and a sweater. She grabbed up her coat and put on her shoes and went off to the kitchen where Hattie was waiting. I followed her, asking if Mrs. Payne was going to be all right, and Aunt Mary said she hoped so, but I could tell that both she and Hattie were very worried. Miss Hattie pulled on her coat and cap and turned to me. "Now, Uncle John will be here in a moment, and there's plenty of food for dinner, and you all can play Monopoly or cards if you like, but make sure you are in bed by 10. And then they rushed out the kitchen door into the night, and I went into my room and got out the games and cards. I wondered what was wrong with Lenny's mother. Mr. John came in after a moment and poured himself some coffee. He gave me some hot cocoa as I unpacked the Monopoly board in pieces. "I'd like a riverboat," he said, as soon as I opened the box, and after we'd played for a long while, we pulled out the leftovers and munched on turkey and ham and dressing with cranberry sauce. After dinner, he told me to go and get my bath and get dressed for bed. When I was done with that, we put away the Monopoly and played a round of Go Fish. Before he said it was time for me to get into bed, he took me to my room and tucked me in. We said a prayer for Lenny's mother. I thought about that ghost wagon and the dream I'd had as Uncle John shut out the lights, telling me that no news was good news. I fell asleep dreaming of Mama that night, and sometime during the next few hours, Eleanor Payne passed away with the doctor and her family at her side. I learned later that over Christmas she had asked a favor of Aunt Mary. She had asked her to help raise Lenny if anything should happen to her. Eleanor had always been sickly, and she hadn't been faring well for the last few years. You know how absent-minded Leonard is. He just can't raise a child by himself, she'd said. I awoke New Year's Day and came through the den to see someone covered in blankets sleeping on the sofa. I crept past so as not to disturb whoever it was and went into the kitchen. And there was Aunt Mary, Hattie, John, and Mr. Harvey. They all sat at the table with Lenny's father. He sat over a cup of steaming coffee, his head in his hands, and they all looked sad, and Hattie was crying. Aunt Mary asked if I'd like some juice, and she poured me a glass. I looked at her and asked what was wrong with everyone. She leaned down and told me that Lenny's mother had passed away. "What happened?" I asked, thinking back to the night my own mama had died, and she told me that Eleanor had just taken a bad turn. Hattie put her hand on my shoulder and smiled. "So let's let Lenny sleep," she said. "Poor baby, he needs his rest." So I was as quiet as I could be. I thought about the ghost wagon and the dream I'd had again. I was sorry Miss Eleanor was gone, and I knew that Lenny would be very, very sad. He finally awoke around 9 a.m. and came into the kitchen all sleepy-eyed and confused. His dark hair was tousled atop his head. He asked how he got there and where his parents were. He didn't seem to remember a thing about the night before. Hattie hugged him and sat him down with me at the table and served us both some breakfast before she sat down with us. The job of breaking the bad news that his mother was gone would be hers, and she hated to have to be the one. But with his father and Aunt Mary back at the parlor to plan Eleanor's funeral, she really had no choice in the matter. Lenny took the news as best he could as tears fell down his cheeks. And I told him about how Mama had been sick and that she died too. And we talked about that for a while until he seemed to accept things a little better. He hugged Hattie and said, "I'll sure miss my mama," which caused her to start crying again. He came into my room with me for a while, but he didn't talk very much. He got a book about pirates and laid on the bed, looking at it. Later that day, Mr. John drove over from the Paynes with most of Lenny's things, and we carried all of them into the bedroom next to mine. The decision had been made that he would stay with us until his father got through this rough patch, and Lenny seemed happy about that. We spent the afternoon fixing his room, unpacking his clothes, and putting away his things, and we got him all settled in. We unpacked his toys and games, taking his mind off his troubles for a little while, and by that evening we were playing with his cars on the floor beside his bed and building a cabin with his Lincoln logs as friends gathered in the dining room. There would be guests coming and going at the inn for days. The aroma of coffee and cake filled the air, and everyone spoke in barely above a whisper. Leonard kept his only son close by his side for the next few days when he was at the tavern. He would reassure him in his own way that everything was going to be all right. It was late in the evening when all of the guests finally left for home. Lenny didn't sleep well that night, and neither did I. We stayed up talking until almost 1 a.m. when Miss Hattie happened to get up for some water and heard us. She made us a pot of hot milk, and we finally went to sleep. And the following day, we all attended the graveside service at the cemetery and returned home again. Something else happened that day. Albert broke it off with Aunt Mary and left the mountain for good. And that night, when I went to my room, I could hear her crying, and I went to comfort her. She said she was very sad about Eleanor, but I also knew that she was sad that she'd lost Albert as well. I actually felt bad for Aunt Mary right then and gave her a hug. Sometimes she could be pretty nice. At bedtime, we all went into Lenny's room, and Aunt Mary pulled herself together enough to read us a bedtime story, and then Hattie led us in our prayers, and we all got a decent night's sleep for the first time in days. Lenny and I would both be back in school, and life would begin to change in this new year. Sometimes I could hear him in his room crying, and I knew how much he missed his mother. I hated starting this new year on a sad note, but what choice did we have?